Viking assimilation. Now that's very interesting topic, which I don't think is often explored properly. Viking assimilation, in other words, relations with other peoples who they conquered or settled among, intermarriage with those people, even conversion to their religion and so on, is a frequently overlooked topic. Welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age, in which I will now be looking at that very topic, assimilation. Now, the Vikings are seen as raiders, pillaging and looting, burning and raping anything female that still had a pulse. Well, something that, yes, they did actually do, but what often came after that, when they traded being Vikings for being settlers, colonists, setting up towns and trading, replacing the sword and the axe with the plough and the carpenter's toolbox, that is so often ignored. Yes, it will be mentioned that Vikings established this or that town somewhere, or they traded stuff from here to there, but the extent of their non-violent activities is usually submerged beneath a plethora of accounts of savage brutality and hatred of people who didn't worship the gods of Asgard, or mostly the Christians. But if you take a close look at their assimilation with peoples whose lands they settled in, admittedly after fighting their way in to begin with in most cases, you find the supposed Viking, or more correctly Norse, hatred of Christians, or anyone else for that matter, is a myth demonstrated particularly here in Ireland, where I live, which I'll come to in a moment, because if you truly hate someone, despise their beliefs, while you may well kill them, you don't marry them or convert to those very beliefs which you are supposed to detest. But as I've just alluded to, it wasn't the Vikings who actually assimilated anywhere. It was the Norse. Isn't that the same thing, you say? Not quite. You see, all Vikings were Norse, yes, but not all Norse were Vikings. In fact, only a minority of Norse people ever became Vikings. And those that did didn't wear horned helmets either. Viking assimilation should, strictly speaking, be called Norse assimilation, because by the time that happened, those people who were assimilating were no longer Vikings in the true sense of that word. They were settlers, colonists, foreign residents, townspeople from somewhere else, or whatever similar term you might like to use, but Vikings they were not. Now, when they'd initially arrived in various countries other than their own, yes, then they were indeed Vikings. They had come in ships, they fought their way ashore, they raided, sometimes leaving again, but later on often remaining and deciding to set up permanent settlements. They were Vikings. Since Vikinger in Old Norse meant a pirate, a seafaring adventurer, one who travelled off in a ship and did great deeds wherever that ship got to. But once they settled down and established villages and towns, began ploughing fields and planting crops, raising children, they were no longer Vikings. They were simply Danes, Norwegians, or Swedes who were living somewhere else. They were Norse, not Vikings. Even if they fought against local native tribes, they were still not Vikings. No ships were involved, and they hadn't just come from somewhere else. They weren't getting off a ship. They were settled townspeople defending their property. Of course, given the fact that now the term Viking is used to describe anything and everything Old Norse, I suppose we're stuck with it. Viking clothing, Viking customs, Viking religion, and so on. Everything gets the Viking prefix. There was no Viking clothing, or customs, or religion. But there was Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish clothing, customs, and religion. But, as I say, we're probably stuck with the term. Norse integration was a feature of many lands. For example, they settled in large areas of what would later become Russia and Belarus, the names of those countries coming from the word used by the Slavs and others in that region to describe them, Rus meaning to row a boat. And within quite a short time, they'd become virtually Slavic themselves, eventually blending totally into the population of that region. In Francia, in 911 AD, King Charles the Simple made an agreement with the Viking Jarl Hrolfr, who would later become known as Rollo, granting him lands around the city of Rouen in return for his becoming a Christian and defending Francia from other Vikings. That region was then known as the land of the Normanni, or the Northmen, and later it would be called Normandy, the Northmen becoming the Normans, and pretty much French, with Norse overtones. Another assimilation with local people who had not initially shared really anything in common with them, certainly not religion. For fans of the Vikings TV series, I'm very sorry to tell you that Rollo had no connection to Ragnar Lothbrok. They were not brothers. They never even met. mainly because Rollo is a genuine historical figure, while Ragnar never existed. He is a composite character of several genuine Viking leaders over a considerable time period, so their meeting, yeah, well, that wasn't going to happen. And also, Rollo is often called the first Duke of Normandy, but in fact, the title Duke of Normandy wasn't used until his great-grandson, Richard II, adopted it. He was the first ruler of Normandy, not the first duke. And of course, that title was made famous in 1066 by Duke William of Normandy when he claimed the throne of England. Now, here to Ireland. Norse integration with the Celtic Irish has always been well known, and by the end of the 11th century there was really no difference between Norse and Gael in religion or daily life, which in itself gives the lie to the idea that the Vikings hated Christianity. They were quite happy to become Christians. But recent DNA studies have shown a far greater Norse ancestry among the Irish population than was previously believed. The first Viking raids on Ireland occurred in 795 AD, and raids became frequent after that for decades, targeting mainly monastic sites and churches, which is where most of the wealth at that time, of course, was to be had. But that was what led to the idea that Vikings hated Christianity. That misconception fueled, of course, by the fact that the early accounts of those raids were written by priests and monks, the only people usually able to read and write at that time. And of course, they saw the Vikings as evil pagans to begin with. And thus, well, they were clearly agents of Satan, trying to wipe the true faith from the face of the earth. Actually, they were only going where the money was. The church had the money, that's where the Vikings went. Now, the Vikings didn't actually settle in Ireland until the winter of 840 to 841 AD, when they set up a camp at Lough Neagh. And then they established another camp known as a longport, where they could safely berth their ships on the river Liffey, which they called Difflin, from the Irish Dovlin, the dark pool. And they remained there over the winter of 841 to 842 AD. That camp then turning into a permanent settlement and eventually becoming the city of Dublin. Other similar camps would become Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, Cork, Wicklow and Carlow as Norse settlement replaced raiding. Trading and even alliances with the native Irish gradually starting to occur, becoming more frequent as time went on. As early as the first decade of the 11th century, the joining of Norse and Gael had become so established that many of the Difflin Norse were Christians. Their king, Sigurd Olafsson, better known as Silkbeard, himself being a Christian, whose father had been a Norse jarl and his mother an Irish princess, which was a common union by that time. Sigurd would later go on a pilgrimage to Rome and found Dublin's Christ Church Cathedral in 1028. And when on Good Friday in 1014 AD, the usurping King Brian Boru, who had already made himself King of Munster, seized the kingdom of Leinster, and declared himself to be the Ard Rí, or High King of Ireland, arrived and tried to take the kingdom of Difflin and add it to his kingdom collection, resulting in the famous Battle of Clontarf, the Dublin Irish fought against him alongside the Norse, or perhaps the Norse Gaels would be a better term for them by that time, because that's what they had become. They were no longer really Norse. Norse acceptance of other people who they settled on is shown very clearly by intermarriage, something you don't do with supposedly inferior people, or by conversion to other religious beliefs. Again, something you don't do if that belief is a thing you wish to destroy. In that regard, the Old Norse were far more accepting and tolerant than the great colonial empires of the 18th to the early 20th century, when any integration of Europeans with native peoples, especially marriage, well, it was virtually unthinkable. Oh, I say, old chap, I mean, one couldn't form relationships with natives. They're little better than animals, after all. You know, they're fit to be slaves to do our bidding, but well, one couldn't bring them home to introduce to mother, could one? And as for their religious beliefs, oh dear me, one does try to convert them, but it's probably a waste of time given their low intelligence. Yes. Unlike the colonial Europeans, the Norse did not regard themselves as vastly superior to others, nor did they hate the religions of others, often accepting conversion. But the important thing is doing so voluntarily. While they would often choose to convert to Christianity, as they did in Ireland, attempts to forcibly convert them, well, that usually resulted in a very severe headache caused by an axe stuck in your head. One way we can establish the degree of intermarriage that took place and the acceptance of it by the Norse is by using DNA to show racial traces, as well as the analysis of items of everyday use that indicate usage over time to establish population levels and so forth in relation to it. A study of DNA in Ireland, published in January of 2018, showed considerably greater traces of Norse DNA than had been expected, principally Norwegian and dated to circa 1000 AD. The Irish gene pool being some 20% Scandinavian, which is quite a lot, showing that it had not been a matter of an individual Norse man or woman here or there occasionally marrying an Irish person, but showed that it was something that must have occurred on a reasonably frequent basis, which, added to the Christianized Norse Gaels fighting King Brian, gives us a picture of acceptance of each other by both Norse and Irish as time went on. But a strange fact has also emerged, thanks in part to so much construction and road building across Ireland during the great financial boom known as the Celtic Tiger, which sadly, of course, is now gone, when archaeological finds were made on a regular basis. Using data algorithms and other techniques, this is really, high-tech scientific stuff, a far cry from when archaeology was just shovels, trowels, and toothbrushes. Scientists from Belfast Queen's University made a most interesting discovery. The population of ancient Ireland may have been as high as almost 2 million, but by the end of the 7th century it was in decline, though why is a complete mystery. There seems to have been a gradual process which rules out a great plague or natural disasters, nor are there any accounts of such things even in the earliest records, nor in fact would a war account for it, though a combination of various factors, perhaps constant warfare, a rise in infectious diseases and so on, could have been a contributing factor. But whatever the cause, this population decline was halted by, yes, the arrival of the Vikings. Now, given their fewer numbers, even were they more successful at reproduction than the native Irish, in other words, if they went at it like rabbits, they were hardly numerous enough to halt a population decline without a degree of interbreeding, if not actually intermarriage, with the Irish. Another thing concerning the Norse relations with the Celtic people is found in Iceland. Now, DNA studies have shown that Norse women accompanied the men to settle abroad, that, as we would expect, men married at home in Scandinavia and took their wives with them when they left to set up settlements, especially in the lands closer to Scandinavia, the Orkney and Shetland Islands, Scotland and other parts of the British Isles, where ancestry from both male and female Norse was established. But when similar studies were done in Iceland, a different picture emerged. In Iceland, by far the largest ancestor group was Norse male, and it's estimated that some 60% of the Icelandic gene pool is Irish and Scottish. So the modern Icelanders are descended largely from Norse men and Irish and Scottish Gaelic women. Why Norse women didn't go to Iceland in greater numbers, as they did elsewhere, well, that's a bit of a mystery. There was no native population in Iceland before the arrival of the Norse, save for a few Irish monks who, apart from being supposedly celibate, they'd have had no women to get up to any hanky-panky with. So any idea of a pre-existing population is out of the question. Now this has led to lurid articles saying how Vikings captured Irish and Scottish women, taking them as slaves with them to Iceland. Icelanders are descended from slaves. It being pointed out that Dublin was the biggest slave market in Western Europe in those days, supplying women from raids into the Irish countryside as well as from raids on Scotland and Britain. But to my mind, that's going on the stereotypical image of the Vikings as savage raiders and rapists. If you follow that line of thinking, then you assume that all those Viking men had no interest in wives and raising families. They just wanted sex slaves, which seems really far-fetched, as well as running contrary to Norse custom and laws. Yes, a lot of men would have had sex with slaves, even married men for that matter, and many Gaelic women probably were taken as captives or purchased at slave markets. But it's far more likely that the vast majority of them went voluntarily as wives. See, the Norse were very committed to marriage and families. It was an integral part of their culture, and it was actually a punishable offence in Scandinavia to deliberately avoid marriage and having children. So sailing off to Iceland with a bunch of sex slaves and not marrying anyone would have been seen as a very serious breach of the law, especially if the whole male population of the country was doing it. And a lot of those women were very likely to have been already integrated into Norse families elsewhere beforehand. But in this again, we see the Norse attitude to other peoples, since, as I pointed out, most of those women going to Iceland were far more likely to be wives rather than slaves, given the known Norse attitudes to marriage. Wives drawn from Christian peoples the Norse had settled among. So, there we have it. The ready assimilation of the Norse, or the Vikings if you prefer, with other peoples who followed a different faith to begin with, shows quite clearly their attitudes were far more liberal and tolerant than many others of their day, or for centuries afterwards. They did not hate Christians per se. They did not set out to destroy Christian places of worship, simply for the sheer enjoyment of doing it. A sort of, one up for Odin every time they burned a church, and extra points for killing a bishop. Now, they could be said to have liked Christians a great deal more than Christians liked them. At least I know of no Christians at the time who willingly embraced the worship of Odin and the gods of Asgard, or married into Norse families and settled down in their towns and villages, or indeed founded their own settlements in Scandinavia. If you have enjoyed this video, which I very much hope is the case, you might consider perhaps subscribing to my channel to receive news of further videos, which would be greatly appreciated, I assure you. So for now, I shall say farewell. Goodbye until next time. And thanks very much for watching this video. Bye for now.